The conclusion to digital media and political engagement worldwide, and our last lecture video together. Some major questions we need to go over to wrap things up, to really see what's going on in the world today in media and politics. First question, how does digital media use influence political engagement? On average, we see that digital media use increases political engagement, particularly online, and particularly for those people who are less inclined to be engaged in politics offline. There are variations in cases around the world, but in general, we have found that across the globe. Every single continent there is. Save Antarctica, because penguins, they have no need for the internet. No. They can slide and go swim. Anyway, but yes, internet use, digital media use increases political engagement worldwide. Now, does that political engagement always lead to political change? No. That brings us to which conditional variables, which contextual variables affect that relationship. How do we go from digital media use to political engagement, to what type of political engagement it is, and to if it equals political change? We have institutional elements, media systems, and the digital divide. Institutional elements, you can generally think of this as regime types. The type of regime mitigates how you are able to influence politics via political engagement. So even if you have digital media use increasing political engagement, the type of regime limits political engagement, regardless. All right? The tech companies were wrong, at least for right now. The internet has not freed the planet. Other variables matter still. The media systems matter, meaning think economic development. Think the dominant medium of the country you're looking at, which also ties into the digital divide. The digital divide still mitigates this relationship. Your level of internet domestication in a country will directly affect how digital media use influences political engagement in that country. That's why internet domestication rate is such a huge thing. That's why media systems are such a huge thing. That's why institutional elements and regime types are such a huge thing. The point is that through all the research we've looked at about how media affect politics, about how the internet affects politics, what we still find, talking about digital media or the internet, is that these same variables still matter a whole lot to mitigating the effect of how digital media and the internet affect political engagement worldwide. We have seen two general trends across the world. We've talked about them, but we haven't pointed them out as real generalizations that we can make about comparative politics. The first one being that the greater the extension and domestication of digital media use, the more types of people, demographically speaking, will have access to the internet. In other words, eventually demographics will not matter as much once internet domestication rates reach a high enough point. And that all of those people will have a higher probability of being able to be politically engaged. However, that is not fated to happen. Has Twitter and Facebook made people more politically engaged? Has YouTube? Some platforms now are offering the ability to turn off political ads. What is that going to do to byproduct learning? We are thinking of this relationship as the internet exists today. I can promise you the internet that we know today was not the internet of 20 years ago. And there's a really good chance that the internet from 20 years from now is not going to be the internet we know today. So this idea is not fated to happen. A lot depends on how technology continues to evolve. The second trend, though, is fated to happen. That while younger generations are the ones who generally use the internet more, generational replacement will take place. What does this mean? This means the older generations, the World War II generations, the older baby boomer generations, even the older Generation X's, as they die off, eventually we will get to a point in time to where everyone in the US who is alive was born or who was very young when the internet came about. What kind of effect is that going to have? Of course, that's going to happen in countries like the US much faster than it's going to happen in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo. Right now, the DRC has an internet domestication of 5%. It will take much longer for generational replacement to take place there than it will here in the US. But let's talk about when generational replacement does happen in places like the US or other countries that have higher internet domestication rates. What will this mean for political engagement? Well, it very much depends on what the internet looks like at that moment. Maybe the internet will be predominantly entertainment, and politics will be such a small portion of the internet at that point. It's hard to say. It really is. I've said this before and I'll say it again. No one would have predicted 10 years ago that Twitter would be the way the President of the United States speaks directly to the population. Yet here we are. So some of these things we can make generalizations about and we can make predictions about. But some of them, like the evolution of tech, that is much more difficult to do. And that does throw a monkey wrench in some of our assumptions about how digital media and political engagement will work moving into the future. Now, putting everything together in the class. Media and politics in comparative perspective. What's it about? This thing of ours. This media and politics. This media beyond the Western world. This democracy in media. This digital media and political engagement worldwide. Do media truly affect politics? Well, I can't give you all the answers. Some of these conclusions you need to come to yourself. This class has never been about me telling you the meaning of life. This class has been about me telling you how to figure it out on your own. So whenever I say, do media affect politics, this is something you need to decide. Now, I can tell you there are 3 things that we have talked about infrequently that if you go on to study more media and politics, you will run into a lot more. And they are worth looking at. Of course, you will need to decide how important are they. And that's agenda setting of the media, it's framing of the media, and priming from the media. Now, independently, these things might not have big effects. But let me put them together for you. And then you tell me what kind of effect media can have on politics. So agenda setting is when media are telling us what stories are important for us to pay attention to. Media are choosing the news for us to read, watch, listen to every single day. That's agenda setting. They're setting our topics of discussion for life. It's pretty powerful. Of course, you don't have to be plugged in, you can ignore it. But even if you don't ignore it, so maybe they're doing it out of the kindness of their heart. Maybe they're doing a good job about it. All right, so cool. Media set the agenda, but who has time to do it all for themselves anyway? Well, what about framing? Framing is the perspective a story is told. So you could have a story about anything, and all of you know that any one story has multiple perspectives. This course is called Comparative Perspective for a reason. Media set the agenda of what stories to talk about. Then They set the frame of the story for us to understand it by. Because many stories, especially in places far from us, we have no context to understand different events. So media have to provide a frame for us to understand it, a frame of comparison, a frame of perspective. All right, cool. Kind of sounds like media are thinking for us, but still, I mean, that's part of news consumption, right? So media are setting the agenda for what is important to us. They're framing the stories for us to be able to understand because we're incompetent. So they're telling us how we should view stories. And then priming. Priming is the idea that when someone else comes back to you and mentions that story or that event from a faraway place, what's the first thing you think about? What the media told you. The frame they painted. The agenda they set. So do media affect politics? When voters in a democracy, at least, now this is democratic specific, but when voters go to the polls and they see a topic of conversation, they see something to vote on, they are primed to think about the frame that was given to them by the agenda that was set by media corporations. Now you tell me, is that important? Is that a big example of media affecting politics? You have to decide that for yourself. But I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the forums. Now, of course, we just talked about media affecting politics. But now let's think about the flip. Do politics affect media? There are 200 countries in the world about. There's about 7.4 billion, 7.5 billion people on Earth. Are most of those countries democracies? Are most of those people living in democracies? I'm going to make you look up that. Because if most countries in the world are not democracies, and if most countries in the world, or rather, if most people in the world live in countries that are not democracies, it means for the majority of the planet, politics affects media more than media affect politics on a global scale. That's comparative perspective. You might be able to tell me in a democracy or in the US all the different ways that media affect politics. But let's think about humanity and the entire planet. Media versus politics, politics versus media. And remember, saying it depends, that's not good enough. Not for us. We've been through an entire class talking about all the different variables, all the different conditions that mitigate the relationship of media affecting politics or politics affecting media. Things like regime type, things like the digital divide, things like levels of economic development, and lots more affect whether media affect politics or politics affect media. And that's without getting into another big topic, and a topic I want to leave you with. And that is the idea of gatekeepers. This class is not focusing on gatekeepers and the power of gatekeepers, because this is really next level. You're starting into graduate level kind of media theory and how media and politics really work. The idea of gatekeepers, those are individuals that control the flow of information. Not just the flow of information, the production of information. Now think about that. What am I saying? So we consume news, we consume information. You know, we can give you a top 10 list on top 10 GDP per capitas in the world, top 10 Freedom House scores in the world, top 10 overall GDPs, largest economies. For years and years and years, where does all that information come from? The information we consume, the information media report on, the vast majority of it comes from governments, even in democracies. How do we know how many people live in the United States? Government. How do we know where these people live in the United States? Government. How do we know internet domestication rates? Government. How do we know what law is going to be passed in the Senate or the House? Government chooses. And they tell media what they're going to do next. Gatekeepers are the ideas that even before you think about media versus politics or politics versus media. News briefings, generally speaking, around the world, the things that media corporations report on, those are meetings called by government. And those governments are the ones who control the production and the flow of information. Who really sets the agenda? Media corporations, or the governments with which laws they decide they're going to work on or not? It's food for thought. But like I said, this course isn't focusing so much on that. That's next level stuff. But stuff we're going to definitely talk about in the forums. I wanted to take this brief moment to say thank you to all of you. And it's really been a pleasure. And if you are seeing this message, if you email me before our last class meeting, you get a bonus point on an assignment that you need. See you soon.